Hello and welcome to the Futures Lab. So the plan for today is to get our gravity working, our jumping working, and also our collision on the y-axis working. But first, I'm going to explain to you what variables are. Now you've probably used variables before, but for this session and the next session, it's vitally important that we understand what variables are and exactly how variables work. So what is a variable? A variable is like a magical box. It contains one thing, a piece of information, that we're going to call data. This data could be a word, it could be a number, it could be something else. Now the important thing is that a variable must have a name. So we've got a variable here that we have called hearts. Now it's got one piece of data inside, in this case a number, the number 10. And we could use this variable to keep track of a game of Minecraft. We have 10 hearts, but what happens if we take 1 point of damage? Well, we replace the old data with a new piece of data. The old data is lost because the variable can only hold one piece of information. So now here's a challenge for you. In this screenshot of Mario, how many variables can you see? Pause the video and write your answer in the comments below. I'll give you a second and then I'll start telling you the answers. Okay, so there's actually a lot of different things that are variables. Some of the more obvious ones are the score over here, the number of coins we've collected, what level and world we're on, and the amount of time we have left. But all sorts of things can be variables. Even things like the X and Y position of various characters like Mario's and the enemies will be stored as variables. And even the state of the character. For example, the game will know to treat Mario differently depending if Mario is standing or moving or jumping. This is going to be important for later. So now let's open our project now that we understand variables a little better. First bit of practice we're going to use in making variables is we're going to tie the speed of our player to a variable. Now you might be thinking, why? This code is working just fine the way it is. We've got 6 and -6 and -6 and 6 right here. But if you wanted to change the speed of the player, you've got to change this in 4 different places. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but what if we could change it in just one place and it would instantly change the speed of the character? That's a lot more efficient. If our code gets larger and more complicated, we want to save ourselves as much time as possible when we're making these kind of changes. And if we tie this to a variable now, we can also make ways of speeding up the player, giving them like a speed boost ability in the middle of the game. So we're going to create this variable now. Click on Variables on the left, then click on Make a Variable over here. We're going to call this Player X Speed. Now it's very tempting to give variables funny names like Bob or Frank or Phil, but it's very important that you name the variable what it actually is, because when you're looking at it in your code and you're trying to figure out what variables do what, it's going to make things very hard for you if you've given them all meme names. So next we're going to press OK right here, and you can see your variable player x speed has just appeared here. We're going to get out set my variable to 0, and we're going to put it right here underneath the green flag. At the beginning of the game, we're going to decide how fast the player should be. So we should probably say that they're 6, so we're going to change this 0 to a 6, and the variable that we want to change is the player x speed variable. So remember, this 6 is going to replace this 0 when we start the game. So you ready to see that happen? Let's hit go, and now the player x speed is 6. Now the next thing that we need to do is take this player x speed variable and put it into these holes here. So let's take out player x speed and put it over that 6, and then let's look down here and we should find another 6. So we'll take another player x speed and put it right here, and we'll test and we'll see if it works, and it does. Nothing's changed. This 6 is being supplied by the variable. But now what do we do with the -6 that's here and the -6 that's here? Well, go to operators, the green category, get out this minus operator or subtract operator, drag it, put it into there, then get another one, and drag it and put it into the other one. And we've got to make sure that our player x speed variable goes after the minus. So we'll get out player x speed, put it right here, and then we'll put another here. When we change x by player speed, then we're changing it by 6. And when we change x by minus player x speed, we're changing it by minus 6. So let's see if that works. Okay, yep, that's really good. Now you have this nice advantage of being able to change the speed here anytime you like. And you can say, oh, I want this player to be moving at 5 instead. Or how about 51? What about that? Okay, yep, now we're going crazy fast. What about just 1? How's that? Okay, very slow. Very easy to change this, which saves you a lot of time when you're trying to balance your game. The other thing that we can do is create a speed boost. So we're going to do just a very simple hack for a speed boost now. We're going to go to Events. We're going to get out when space key pressed. And let's change this space key to, let's say, the letter Q, right in the corner of your keyboard. And so then what we're going to do is we're going to go to Variables. We're going to set the player x speed variable to 10. And then we'll get out another set player x speed back to 6. And then we'll go to Control and get out a wait 3 seconds in between the two. So let's see what that looks like now. So if we hit go, we start moving, we press Q, and suddenly we're speedier. And then we'll slow down again after 3 seconds. And you can see this number here changing as well. Each time I hit the speed boost, this 6 will turn into a 10. There we go. Now, if you really like it, you can keep your speed boost code in, but I'm not going to use it, so I'm just going to chuck that away for now. So now we're ready to create gravity. So click on My Blocks, just like we did before for move right and move left. We're going to click on Make a Block. We're going to call this Gravity, and then we're going to press OK. We should now have this define gravity. I'm going to move this around. We don't really need our move left and move right at the moment, so I'm going to focus in on define gravity. Now remember, we have to get out our gravity my block and put it into our main loop, our forever loop. So now we're going to make a new variable. We're going to go to Variables, we're going to click on Make a Variable, and we're going to call this variable player y movement. So remember that X controls sideways movement and Y controls up and down movement. Now, you'll notice I call this player Y movement, and our other one is called player X speed. The reason I didn't call this player Y speed was because the player Y movement is going to behave very differently to the player X speed. And if they're both named the same thing, then kind of you'd assume they'd work the same. Now what we're going to do is, instead of setting this variable, we're going to change this variable. Get out a change my variable by 1 and put it underneath define gravity. Then change this my variable into player Y movement. And you can see, wow, that number is going crazy high. And if we stop and start, you'll notice the number never goes down again. Now this is very important. Most of your variables, you should always set them back to a default value at the beginning of the game. So let's get out a set player Y movement to 0, and let's put that right here underneath when green flag clicked. So it should make sense. We can set the variable, which just puts in the new number. If we change the variable, we're either adding a number, or if we put in a minus, we are subtracting from the number. So we want this number not to be going up, but we want this number to be going down, because down is the direction that gravity is going to pull our player. So I'm going to change this 1 into a minus 1.5. That's an amount of gravity that I really like for this game. Now the other thing is, when we hit go, this is now going to go into minus numbers, but our player isn't actually moving. All we're doing is changing a variable. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to motion, get out a change y by 10, but we're going to change y by our player y movement. And then when we test that, our player should always fall towards the bottom of the screen. So now we need to do our Y movement collision. Just like we had the player collide with our X movement, if they moved into a wall, we move them back out again. We're going to do the same with the floor. So in order to do that, we're going to go to Control. We're going to get out an if then. We're going to go to Sensing and get out a touching platforms. And then we're going to go to Motion and get out a change Y by 10. Now, unlike our sideways movement, which is always the exact same speed, we can actually speed up and fall faster and faster and faster as this number gets bigger and bigger and bigger, or lower and lower and lower. So what we're going to need to do is get the player to figure out how far up out of the floor they need to go. So for something like that, a repeat loop will be great. So let's go to Control. Let's get out a repeat until. Let's put it into this gap. Then let's go to Operators and get out a not operator. Drag this and put it here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to Sensing and get out a touching platforms. So now we are going to repeat something until we are not touching the platforms anymore. And what we're going to do is get this change Y by 1. And now the player is going to go up pixel by pixel until they are no longer inside the floor, sitting on top of it. And then they're going to stop moving. So let's see what that looks like, shall we? Okay, that's interesting. We can see the player going into the floor, and they are also pushing back out. But that is not what we want to happen. They're pushing out very slowly. And you'll notice, look at this number here. This is the speed at which we are falling. We are falling faster and faster and faster. So we actually need to stop falling once we've hit the floor. So we're going to go to Variables, and we're going to get out a Set Player Y Movement to 0. And let's put this right at the bottom here. Let's hit Go, and that's much better. The player is no longer pushing very slowly out of the floor, but they are kind of bumping up and down. They're kind of bouncing now still. Now, if we want that sort of bumping, vibrating to stop, we need to make sure that when the player leaves the floor and gets up out of the floor, it needs to happen instantaneously, which is something we can do with MyBlocks. So if you go to MyBlocks, click on Make a Block, we're going to call this Y Collision. Then press OK, and then all of our collision code, which is this bit here, if touching platforms, we're going to take this away, and we're going to put it underneath Define Y Collision. Once we've moved all of this here, we still need to put our Y Collision MyBlock right here. Now, we can make all of this code run instantaneously if we edit Define Y Collision and then click on this button here, Run Without Screen Refresh. Then press OK. And look at that. It's perfect. No more bouncing, no more entering the floor at all. Now, just one thing to remember is that it's very tempting to have fun with this Run Without Screen Refresh function, but if you ever use it, just be careful, because depending on the code that you put in here, you might cause your game to crash or freeze. And I'm going to show you exactly the kind of thing that can cause that a little bit later in this session. But for now that we've got our downwards Y movement, our falling working, let's get our jumping working. Let's click on Make a Block up here. Let's call this Jump. Let's press OK. Now we have to make sure that the jump is inside our forever loop over here, and then we can decide what we're going to put underneath our define jump. So first let's decide what controller we're going to use for the jump button. I'm going to use the up arrow key. So let's go to Control, get out an if then go to Sensing, get out a key up arrow pressed, and then we've got this very useful player Y movement variable. Let's just try setting that variable and see what happens. Let's go to variables, and let's get out set player Y movement to 10. All right, let's see what that does. We hit go, we can move around, and if I press the up arrow, oh, that's cool. Now, we can jump infinitely, kind of like Flappy Bird. We can sort of do as many jumps as we want in the midair. And the other thing is that we can jump onto the platforms. Oh, but you've probably already noticed something. What happens if we hit the bottom of a platform? We go straight through. It treats a ceiling exactly the same way as it treats the floor. And are you ready to see that crash I promised? What happens if we go up like this? Oh, now we are stuck in the ceiling. None of my controls are working, and the entirety of Scratch has crashed because our player's gotten stuck into the ceiling. It's trying to get up above it, but there's nowhere for it to go. That's the end of the Scratch level. It's stuck in an infinite loop right here, forever trying to repeat this. And it can never escape from this infinite loop, so none of the other code ever runs. Hence, this is called a freeze or a crash. So that's definitely something we need to fix. Somehow, we need to make it so that if the player goes up into the ceiling, it pushes them down out of the ceiling. But if they go down into the floor, it pushes them up out of the floor. But the question is, how do we know when the player is hitting up into the ceiling or down into the floor? Because the platforms are all the same. Well, here's a solution. If you make your player jump up and down, you'll notice that this player Y movement variable is changing all the time. You can see the number going up into a positive number as they're jumping up, and if they start falling back down, you can see just for a second that it becomes a minus number. In fact, if I try and stop it just at the right time, you'll notice, there we go, a minus number because the player is currently falling. So all we need is a way of checking to see if this variable is positive or negative. Let's go to operators and let's get out a more than operator. That's this one here. It's an arrow pointing towards the right, and then there's a 50 here. We're going to go to variables and get out a player Y movement, and then we're going to change this 50 into 0. This little bit of code will now tell us if the player is moving up or if they're moving down. And we need one of two different things to happen depending if the player is moving up or if they're moving down. So for that, we're going to need an if, then, else. So go to Control, get out an if, then, else. Just put it here for now. And this whole bit of code will slot in there. Now, if the player Y movement is more than 0, that means we're traveling up, so we want the code for dropping out of the ceiling here. Otherwise, they're moving down, and we want the code that brings them up out of the floor here, which is this right here, this repeat until. So let's get out this repeat until, put that right here. And we can do something very, very similar, just needs to be in reverse, for pushing the character out of the ceiling. So right click on repeat until, duplicate, put it right here, and change this 1 to a -1. We put this whole thing back into if touching platforms, and then we put this set player Y movement to 0 right at the bottom. And you'll notice, very important, that we don't set the Y movement to 0 before we do this check. Otherwise, we'll completely mess up our code. And then let's give it a test. All right, if we jump up now, do we... Oh, and we bounce off the ceiling. That's perfect. Excellent. Now, there's one more thing we need to fix. Currently, we have an infinite number of jumps. We can just keep jumping as many times as we want. But we actually want it so that you can only jump if you've touched the floor. So let's create a variable that keeps track of if our player is allowed to jump or not. So we're going to go to variables. we're going to click on make a variable, and we're going to call this variable player jump. Now inside player jump, we're going to have either a 0 or a 1. The 0 will mean the player is not allowed to jump, and the 1 will mean the player is allowed to jump. This is actually called Boolean data. It's used all the time. Scratch doesn't need us to tell it that we're using Boolean data, but other programming languages would need us to specify, oh, this isn't a number, this is Boolean. There are only two possibilities, true or false. So what triggers our ability to make the player be able to jump? It's hitting the floor. Then they're allowed to jump. So let's get out for now a set player jump to 1, which means yes, we can jump. And let's move that set player jump to right here. Now we need to make it so that we're only allowed to jump if this variable is 1. So let's go and look for our define jump. Let's get out a if then, put it around this whole bit of code. And then we're going to go to operators and get out an equals operator. This one right here, and put it into that gap. We want to see if the variable player jump is equal to 1. If it is, we can do a jump. If it isn't, we can't do a jump. And once we've jumped, we want to be able to make it so that we can't just keep jumping. So once the jump actually happens, we need to set player jump to 0. Let's see what that does for now. Let's hit go. And now we can only do one jump. We can't jump in midair anymore. It's actually a very little jump. I think we might need to fix that. If we want to make them to jump higher, all we need to do is change this 10 here into a 20. Let's hit go again. Oh, that's a much better jump. Excellent. So now we can jump way up and we can keep jumping every time we hit the floor. But there's one little problem. Have you noticed what happens if we hit the ceiling? If we hit the ceiling, that also resets our jump. So we can kind of stick to the ceiling, kind of like Spider-Man. Now, if you like that, if you're happy with that, you can keep it if you want. But I don't want the character to be able to do that. They're not supposed to have that ability. So I need to figure out, why is it doing that? And the answer lies in where we put our set player jump. This happens whenever we hit either the floor or the ceiling. We want it to only happen if we're hitting the floor. Remember, where is that in our code? Right here, if player movement more than 0, so this bit here is the ceiling, and this bit here is hitting the floor. So if we take this set player jump and put it right here, set player jump to 1, let's see what happens now. If I hit the ceiling, no, I just bounce off. That's great. That's perfect. That's exactly what I want. Now, there are plenty of variables that you want the player to be able to see, like the number of hearts your character has, or the number of points, or any number of other things. But we don't want the player to see these variables, because it's not really useful information to the player. We need the variables to be around, but we'd much rather they just sort of existed in the background. So, to do that, all you need to do is click on these little ticks here, and those variables will no longer be visible when you're playing the game. And if you ever need to see them again, maybe you're implementing some code and it's important for you to see what the variables are doing, you can just tick them again to check and see how they're doing. That's all we have time for this week. I hope you've had fun and learned something. Subscribe and ring the bell if you want to see the next episode, and let me know in the comments what you would like me to do next, or if you need any help with your code. I can't answer the comments like I used to, but if you're an experienced coder and you've had no problems with today's lesson, have a look at some of the comments, see if someone's asking a question that maybe you could give some good advice for. Aside from that, stay awesome, be cool to each other, and take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time, ninjas.